J.R. Tolkien's The Birth of Gollum. Chapter 1. The Black Years. There are some among men, even among those who still preserve their long lives after the first assault of the shadow, who will not use either word, moon or sun, nor anything of the kind. They say that even to speak the names of ancient things is to give them power, though, of course, it has proved impossible to prevent their continued use in many daily occurrences of language. For instance, in such things as moonlight and sunrise. But they will not say moon or sun in the plain and open, as a matter of habit. Their hearts are chilled, and their minds are clouded about such matters, and it is enough for them to know, if they reflect upon it at all, that there were ages long ago, in the world's youth, when the great lights were different. At best they regard the sun, as it shines now, with dim eyes. In their hearts, they still see the glory that has departed. Many of the wise now say that the sun that we see is not the original sun or even a true sun. It is at the best a token, a vision in fading color of the mighty conflagration that it replaced. The moon is less like the original moon, and the wise take more heed of her. Even in the days of her diminishment, she is an object of dread and mystery. And those that watch her know that she is falling slowly and surely towards mortality, and that someday she will fade and flicker and die. Then the night will be more like the night that was before the ancient sun. It is said that the original moon, which gave light to the first age of the world and a good part of the second, was a mighty disk of glittering crystal. Its light was cold and clear. It hung in the air, a silent globe, a couple of hours after the sun, when the sun had gone down, and it shone for a long while as a great white diamond before it too vanished beneath the immeasurable waves. But the moon that now wanes is a broken thing, a ragged ring, a shrinking ghost. See, the white edge is biting into the black like melting ice. The original moon was probably the greater of the two. The original sun may have been larger than he now is, but in the end it was the victory of heat over light, of the great fire, Lord over the ice, Lord in the council of the Valar. It was the beginning of our age. The world grew dim and mortal, and the first of mortal hearts was moved to fear. The sun drove the moon under the shadows. The sun drove the moon under the shadows. The sun's rays reach farther, but the moon see further. The sun rules the day. The moon dominates the night. That is the way of it. The world was changed, and men have become as mortal men. The sun now drives the great winds that scatter the remnants of the old years. They blow cold, for there is no longer any great heat in the world to fill them. The Valar have retreated, and the world is in shadow, as we know it, until a new age comes, either the fire ages or the forest ages. It is said, to some there still lingers a memory that the sun was not always victorious. A time comes to every mind when it cannot remember how things once were, but now seem always to have been so. But still, the old wise say, the sun was not always so great. Even in the days of our fathers, the moon was in the kingdom of the stars. They say that the Valar, fearing that the light of the sun would prove too strong in the first years after the coming of the sea, made the sun go away and hide in the forest of night. They say that the sun has indeed gone back, as it were, to his childhood. He will return when the time is ripe, and then he will grow very quick. Not until the end of the world will the moon wear as fair a face as she had of old, but she will give her light to him, and together they will hurl the shadow from the earth, and all the world will rejoice again. But that is far off. Meanwhile, the moon is mistress of the night. These are some of the words of the wise. But to the hearts of all, wise and simple, the moon holds some dreadful memory. It was long ago in the moon, days that the dark things began their war upon the earth, and the shadows had not yet been named. Then the land was wide and silent, and the sea was deep. The first rumour of terror was a thin wailing in the empty hours before morning. Those who looked heard the thin cry of Gollum. Others besides Gollum were crying. Far away were the faint cries of the dwarves and of the elves, but the cry of Gollum was more chill and more desperate. The sound of it was like the screech of a bird of prey, but it was colder, like the cry of an evil thing in the frosty night. He came with the first freeze in the first dawn of the long victory of the shadow. He was born in the moon days. The year that Gollum came was the year that was called night, shade in the calendars of the kings. That name was given to all the years that followed, down through the long centuries to the Third Age, until the return of the sun grew hopeful again. The kings did not count those years at all, unless, perhaps, as a parenthesis in the history of the world. But the people remembered them and still give them a name. For in the night, shade, the kings went into the long and silent dark, and the tower of Serith Gorgor was builded. And the tower stood alone amid the ruin of Gondor, and the lamps were put out in the city of the kings. And in that dark hour, the power of the Black Land grew. But already the terror of the long evening was spread over the face of the earth, and shadows sat in the bright noon, and the hearts of men were filled with fear. The great fires were going out. In the desolate valleys and the empty hillsides they could be seen, smoking. Still, occasionally the great brazen beacons blazed for a while, fitfully, before they went out forever. But men turned away their eyes from that mournful and ominous light. They sought places dark and deep. Some delved caves in the ground. Some fled to mountain peaks. As for Gollum, the cold blew into his cave. But he had no fire, and that made little difference to him. The moon was growing dim, and he was hungry. The sea was deep and vast, and its shores desolate. Who would live by the cold margins of the sea in the waning of the world? But the Valar had long ago forbidden men to dwell by the sea. East of the mountains, in the latter days that should come, for it was not permitted that mortal men should see the face of the Lord of Rome when he came back. In those days men fled south or turned aside and went west, or sought the wilderness. Few now went east, so there were few folk in the vales of Anduin. And Gollum had no neighbours. He was alone, though the night was full of lonely sounds. Of old, there had been many reeds and rushes in the marshes. But now there were only the dry stems of the plants he had eaten in his youth, when he was still foolish, and a great deal of fine grass. He tried that, but it was bitter to the root. A small, squat hobbit of a creature, he bent over the ground, for his voice had not yet brought him to his full length, and the grass came up to his nose. He looked up. The moon was shining, a cold light as a snake's eye. He hissed once again. The night mist began to wane. It was the waning of the moon, Gollum's moon. The old crystal world was crumbling. The mist was flying, revealing the barren land. The wind grew colder. But Gollum was now hungry indeed, and he crawled away from the sea back through the grey and withered grasses until he came to a tumbled bank. He looked over it. He found a valley, not a great valley. Not a great valley, narrow and deep as a bay amid the hills. Its mouth was now at his feet. Its further end, maybe 15 miles off, was shut by a wall of grey stone, rising to a long ridge that looked like an island in the mist. Gollum was licking his lips. The sight of dry land did him good. Not that he was any friend of land, but he was a fish out of water, a bird without wings. He was hungry. It was difficult to find a living thing in a damp meadow on the margins of the sea. In the moon, shadows, but the very air in that stony valley smelled of things that once had been alive. Gollum's nostrils twitched. He plunged forward, and he turned neither to the right nor to the right nor to the left, for he did not know that he was going in a straight line. It seemed to him that he could feel the slant of the land, as a fish can feel the current as it swims. He went swiftly, and he was now a lean creature, as lean as a snake. It seemed to him that he could go quicker than ever before. Yet at the same time he was more cautious. In those days eyes were sharper, but ears were sharper, but ears were keener still. Smell was not neglected either, and all his senses were on guard as he drew near to the valley's end. He peeped over the grey ridge, putting his head between two wide boulders. He had come to a cliff's edge, such cliffs as are found all along the western rind of the world, where the sea has gnawed at the hills. The cliff was sheer, but the sea was far down. 50 fathoms or more, one dark blue gulf. Gollum's mouth watered. There was life in the water. He could see it gleaming, but he was too hungry to waste time climbing down. He crawled forward along the cliff. He was very cautious, for it seemed to him that he heard voices. He stopped. Voices. What did he know of voices? But there they were again, and there is a smell of food. He crawled on. Then he saw what was the matter. A fire. There was a fire aloft. Light in a dark place, he hissed. He now went quicker than ever before. He had found a road down. It was made by the hands of men out of long ago. Yet the hands of men today would have made a road much the same. It was a path that went on, without turning or doubling back, from some distance above the cliff's edge to within a few paces of the brink. And there for a while it followed the brink. It was broad, as paths then used to be, and on the top the ground was pretty level, though as it approached the end it leaned out over the sea. On it a man could walk fast and far, either to survey great distances or to escape from enemies. It was made when the last war against the enemy was thought to have been not far off, and the men of that day made great roads by the shores of the sea and kept up the old highways into the mountains in the days before the slow horses were bred. But now there was no traffic on this road. It was forgotten and unmended. Weeds grew in the stone, joints, and yet it was still broad and clear enough at the edge where the most vigorous weeds struggled with the wind. The last few paces before the abyss were cracked and crumbling. Gollum was now almost at the end of the road. Before him, where it leaned out, was only one great dark mass of water. The black bulk of it filled half the sky. He lifted up his snake, eyes to it. He felt afraid. He did not like fire. He was hungry and he was afraid. The voices troubled him. And what were these men doing? They were cooking. They were roasting fish. They were making a feast. There were 3 of them. They sat on the ground near the cliff's brink, against a great humpbacked rock. And they were laughing. One held a spit with a fish on it. He turned it towards the fire. The other 2 were carving up a second fish on a stone. They threw some scraps and bones into the sea, and the gulls cried. The stench of fish came to Gollum's nose. He licked his teeth. He could hardly contain himself. His glands swelled and his mouth watered. He stole forward. He felt he could almost understand what they were saying. Their talk and the smell of the fish were enough to overcome his fears. A strange thing about men in those days was that their voices could be heard a long way off, and anyone could understand any other voice. But if you went up and spoke to them, for some reason even a Gollum found it difficult to make himself heard. Maybe it was only men that had this advantage. Gollum had never thought much about such things. He was too busy. Anyway, he found it difficult to make them attend to him. And when he did get a word in, his voice seemed thin and tinny to him. Not that they were wicked or cruel. On the contrary, they seemed a lot like the people that Gollum had known in his childhood, though more boisterous and noisy. Some of his own kind used to be like that. Now that he was grown up, he seldom met anyone like that. For though he could still talk and understand a bit of his old language, most people now spoke another tongue. The change began not long after the coming of the moon, and the change had gone far since then. Many of his old words had become different, and a lot of new words had been invented. Gollum knew the new words, for he had to use them himself, but he still preferred the old. As a matter of fact, he much preferred the old ways in general, and he often felt that the new things were only a make-believe and a pretense. He felt the same towards these men. They seemed only a pretense of what men used to be. The old men in old tales. These were only big boys. However, after trying a few words that had not become much altered, Gollum got them to understand that he was very hungry. "Yes," said one, "I am hungry too, but I'm not going to eat Gollum. Are there any more fish?" They didn't understand the word Gollum, and they had never heard of such a name. They gave him a fishbone, and he went away. It was raw, and it stuck in his throat on the way. The smell of the cooked fish grew stronger. He went back. He was now so hungry that he wondered if he would live through the night. He crawled towards them as well as he could. A shadow fell on him. A man stood up and looked down on him. He stepped forward. "What is your name?" he asked in a loud voice. "I'm Gollum," said Gollum. His voice seemed to have got very thin as he had crawled nearer to the fire. "What's that you say?" "You're Gollum. What's that you've got in your mouth?" He stepped forward again. On the edge of the fire, light Gollum could see that he had a weapon like a stick, but with a spike on the end. A sort of thing that a man might use when he met an animal on the road. Poor old fish, thought Gollum. He meant to have them all to himself. "I've got no Gollum," said Gollum, though now he was really Gollum, and his name and the feeling that went with it had come over him all at once. Not Gollum, but fish, old dry bone, fish, fish, raw bone, fish, raw fish, raw bone, fish, raw fish. His back legs were twitching. He felt weak, but he was also beginning to feel fierce. He had to have food, and soon. Now he forgot the men. They were only trouble. They were in his way. They were in his way. They were enemies. He wanted fish. He gathered himself together for a spring. He could jump. But at that moment, one of the men threw another bone to the gulls. It looked to Gollum like the last bone of the last fish. His rage burst like a spark in a dry reed. His legs were going like snakes. His eyes blazed. Without any more warning, he sprang at the man with the spike. The man was surprised, but he was a sturdy fellow, the son of sturdy sires. He had been through a long and hard school. In the bad old days when the shadows had still been alive and well, and men were the prey of the evil things. He might be boisterous and rowdy, but he knew the meaning of peril, and his fingers were not slow in drawing his weapon. In a moment he had spike in hand, and the hilts of his knives were pressed against his belt. But Gollum now was on him. His jaws were open. His yellow fangs were bared. A snarl is all that can be said of the dreadful noise that came from his throat. He was a mere handful, but he was furious, and he had the advantage of surprise. He was on the man before he was aware of the danger. He sprang back. But even as he did so, as his balance went forward, he trod heavily on the end of the path. The stone edge was sharp, and the hilt of one of his knives slipped. He fell on the point. Then Gollum was on him. The man struggled, but Gollum had teeth and nails, and the fire was in him. He was mad with hunger. The man fought on for his life, but Gollum had him down and was at his throat, and though the man got his knife blade under the jaws, they closed on his windpipe. It seemed to Gollum that the last thing he heard was the loud voice of his enemy gasping, "Let go, you little devil, or I'll let the air out of you." That sounded like advice, but Gollum did not intend to take it. He was just going to kill the man and have all the fish when something went over him like a cloud. His jaws loosened, his legs gave way. He fell off the man and lay quite still. He heard the crack of the knife, blades by his ear, and felt the cold point of the spike. Then he passed out. When Gollum came back, it was broad daylight. The men were hauling the cliff on either side of the path. Their ropes met above him, and the cliff crashed down like a towering wall of breaking stone. Gollum was buried deep. He was bruised to pieces, but he was alive, barely aware, confused, stunned, but alive. And still very hungry. The stench of fish was in his nostrils, but his legs would not carry him. He could only lie and be miserable. When he had got his breath back and had got over the pain of being squashed, he made an effort and crawled out from under the rubble. The men were still at work. The road behind was blocked. In front of him was a sheer drop. The chasm that he had not noticed the evening before. The great cliffs were now revealed, sea-smoothed and sea-sculpted, towering hundreds of feet into the sky. He looked up. Light was pouring down. He felt that his eyes had never seen such light before. It hurt them. He looked away. And then he saw a sight that he'd never imagined. He was on an island. He blinked. He rubbed his eyes, but the amazing fact remained. He was on a great rock thrust out into the sea. On either side of him the sea roared in. The sea roared in. The noise drowned all other noises, and the spray dazzled his eyes. A vast gulf of water lay before his feet, and beyond that were the endless miles of the sea, blue under the morning. He had come out of the valley at the end of the old road that men had made, and men still used it down to the very brink of this dreadful chasm, and they still climbed down the rope. Ladders for any bridles or saddles had long since perished in the wild years, to the green sward on the other side, and drove their horses up again. Beyond the chasm, to the right and left, the old road faded in the distance. It wound up into the hills to gather the dews and rain drops of the high, cold air. But on the island were many paths, for it was green and wet, and there were grass and herbs, and even some stunted trees. And here there was a broad, flat space, as if men had made it with their great flats and spades. And from side to side, men had laid many flat stones. Here and there among them, fires were smoking. Men were cooking. The air was full of the smell of frying and roasting. Gollum's mouth watered. He licked his lips. He staggered forward. His head was dizzy. He was giddy from hunger. He had crawled a dozen paces towards the smoke. When he became aware that men were shouting at him, he stopped. They were still using the old language, but they had long swords and spears, and they had round shields with the devices of various houses upon them. A snake was among the devices that most frightened him. He remembered the snake, eyes of the spike. Also, one of the men had a spike. He felt very frightened, but he was too hungry to turn back. He moved forward slowly, and he found that he could understand a good deal of what they were saying, and they seemed to be arguing hotly about him. It appeared that one of them had seen a creature crawling, or thought he had seen a creature crawling towards their cooking place in the dead of night, but he had not stopped to make sure. Then another had seen something or heard something, and so on. But they could not agree, for the light was so dim. Gollum knew that they were talking about him, but they did not realize it, for they all supposed that there was someone else present, someone invisible in the shadows. Gollum had no desire to make himself visible, and he crept forward, step by step, until he was within a few paces of the men. Then he flung himself on the ground and pretended to be dead. It seemed to him that they were arguing fiercely about his body. Some wanted to cut it to pieces. Others said he was only having a sleep. Let him lie. It felt very uncomfortable lying on cold, hard stones and not being able to do anything, but he was too hungry to move. Then they kicked him and poked him with their weapons. That was too much. He got up with a yell, and with another yell he changed himself right before their eyes. He had expected to seem the same as before, only a little larger, but the change was far greater than that. It hurt him. He felt all his bones cracking. His hands and feet seemed to sprout, his legs bowed, his heart nearly burst. He found he could talk in his new voice, but he had no breath for yelling, and he could only whisper. Then he saw that his trick had not done any good. The men had drawn their swords. Two had spears with very sharp-looking heads, much sharper than the horn of a unicorn. He felt afraid again, very afraid. He shrank back, but that seemed to be just the wrong thing to do, for the men jumped forward. One seized him. Another held the spear ready to stab him. That evening, or what little was left of it, was a miserable one for Gollum. He was filthy. He was bruised. He was bruised. He was terrified, and on top of everything he was very hungry indeed, but he had an acorn stuck in his throat.